Her father pulled a loose stone from the sheepfold wall during spring thaw and held it aside so she could see the gap behind it. Cold air moved through the hollow. Meltwater trickled down through broken rock, finding its own path, and the smell that came out was mineral and old, the smell of a hillside breathing. He placed her palm flat against the wet stone face. She was younger than her granddaughter was now. She could feel the wall leaning into the hill, pressing tighter where the earth pressed back. "A wall breathes or it dies," he said. 30 years later, and an ocean away, she stood in a Dakota depression with a hammer in one bleeding hand and a winter coming that no one in the settlement believed would be different from the last. Bure Kavama had buried one husband and one son before she turned 56, and each time the ground had been harder than the last. The son died first in the order that mattered, not first in years. Her husband Elling had gone in Minnesota, coughing blood into a tin cup while the lake ice groaned outside, but first in the way that broke the path forward. Her son Torbjörn had been hauling second-hand roof boards from a sawmill siding 11 miles east of Kettle Creek when the wagon tipped on a rutted grade. The boards shifted. The rear axle caught soft ground. Torbjörn went under the load sideways, and by the time a freighter found him, the boards had done what boards do when they carry their own weight, plus a man's. They brought Torbjörn home on the same wagon that killed him. Marte, 9 years old, stood in the half-frame doorway of the cabin her father had been roofing and watched two men she did not know carry a shape wrapped in canvas. Bure did not scream. She set down the knife she had been using to split kindling and walked to the wagon and pulled the canvas back far enough to see his face. Then she pulled it forward again and told the men to lay him beside the east wall where the ground was softer. That was September. The cabin was 16 feet by 20, 4 log courses short of full height, with roof poles cut but not set. The poles were cottonwood, light and cheap and prone to bowing under any load heavier than tar paper. Torbjörn had known that. He had gone for the sawmill boards precisely because cottonwood poles alone would sag by January. Now the boards lay scattered on a hillside grade 11 miles away, and the man who understood their purpose lay beside the east wall wrapped in freighter's canvas. Bure had $11 in coin. She had a sack of rye flour, 2 smoked hams, 1 cracked stove that drew unevenly, and an ox named Burnt whose left shoulder had swollen after dragging stumps all summer. She had 160 acres of Dakota grassland that she could not sell, could not leave, and could not survive on without a finished roof over her head and her granddaughters. She could not leave because leaving meant losing the claim. The Homestead Act required residence and improvement. Walk away for a winter, and the land office could rule abandonment. Torbjörn had filed the original papers. Bure had refiled in her own name after Elling died, and Torbjörn urged her west, and the claim was legal. A single woman over 21 could hold land as firmly as any man on paper. But paper did not care whether you froze. The claim required a body on the ground, and Bure's body was the only one left who could hold it. She also owed Addison Vale $28. Nails, lamp oil, winter credit advanced against the promise of a crop that Torbjörn would now never plant. Vale's store was the only source of supply between Kettle Creek and the railroad, and Vale kept his ledger the way a hunter keeps a trap line, patient, thorough, and checked every morning. The survival math was not complicated. It was impossible. A Dakota winter required at minimum 6 cords of seasoned wood for a cabin this size, assuming tight chinking, a working stove, and a roof that held wind out. Bure had 1.5 cords. She had no money to buy more. The nearest timber worth cutting stood 4 miles north along a creek drainage, and cutting, splitting, and hauling 4.5 cords of green wood with a lame ox and a 9-year-old girl was not a task that could be measured in effort. It was measured in weeks, and she did not have enough of those either. 6 weeks until the ground froze too hard to set post holes. 8 weeks until sustained cold. 10 weeks, maybe 12, until the deep winter that everyone in Kettle Creek talked about the way sailors talk about open water, with respect that looked a lot like fear. Bure stood in the doorway of the unfinished cabin on the morning after the burial and looked at the roof poles leaning against the west wall. Cottonwood. Light, soft, cheap. Good enough for summer shade. She had watched cottonwood poles hold sod roofs in Minnesota, and she had watched cottonwood poles bow and crack under January snow in Minnesota, and she had helped Elling replace 3 of them in the dark while ice fell from the gap above their bed. She knew what those poles would do. She also knew she had nothing else. Orrin Phelps arrived on the 3rd day. He came not out of kindness, but out of the habit of a man who had built most of the structures in Kettle Creek and considered any unfinished building a personal insult to the trade. Phelps was 59, former Army, a carpenter who had framed barracks at Fort Abraham Lincoln and officer housing at Fort Rice before mustering out and settling where the work was. He walked with the careful economy of a man whose knees had absorbed 20 years of sawing on cold ground. He did not knock. The cabin had no door yet. He stood at the threshold and looked at the interior the way a doctor looks at a wound, assessing not the pain, but the probability. Beret was inside, fitting a log section into the 4th course with Marte bracing the far end. Phelps watched for a full minute without speaking. Then he stepped in and ran his hand along the top course. "Your notching is sound," he said. "My husband taught me." "Your husband is not here." "No." Phelps walked the perimeter. He touched the stove, opened the firebox, looked at the crack running down the left side plate, and closed it without comment. He stepped outside and counted the roof poles. He came back in. "You have 1.5 cords stacked," Phelps said. "Maybe less. Some of that birch is punky." "I know. You need 6 minimum to get through to April. 6 is lean. 7 is safe. 8 if the stove keeps losing heat through that crack." "I know." Phelps crouched beside the stove and sighted along the roofline framing. "These poles. Cottonwood?" "Cottonwood." "Flat roof?" Torbjorn planned flat. Sod and tar paper. It was what he could afford. Phelps nodded slowly. He was not unkind. He was precise, which was worse. "A flat roof with cottonwood poles and sod cover will hold through most winters if you shovel after every storm. It is fast. It is cheap. It works if you do the labor." Beret looked at him. "And if I cannot shovel? If a storm comes wet and freezes before morning? Then you shovel harder, or you shovel sooner." "I have seen snow that does not wait for a shovel." Phelps stood. He was taller than Beret by a head, and he used the height without meaning to. "Mrs. Kavame, I have built in this territory for 11 years. Snow falls light here. It is not your mountain snow. It is not your coast snow. It is dry. It blows. It drifts, and drifts can be managed. You are bringing fears from a country that does not apply." Beret said nothing for a moment. Marte had stopped bracing the log and was watching from the corner with the watchfulness of a child who has learned that adult silence means something is being decided. "I have seen snow fall wet," Beret said quietly. "I have seen it freeze on a roof and bond. I have seen a second snow fall on the first and lock. My father called it mortar snow. You lay mortar between bricks and it holds forever. That snow lays itself. Your father built in Norway. This is Dakota. Snow does not know the difference." Phelps pulled on his gloves. The conversation was over for him. He had assessed the situation, delivered his professional opinion, and found the patient unwilling to accept the diagnosis. At the door, he turned back. "Snow falls light, Mrs. Kavame. Fear makes it heavy." He left. Marte watched him go, then looked at her grandmother. Beret's hands were shaking, but not from cold. She pressed them flat against the log wall until they stopped. "Is he right?" Marte asked. Beret did not answer the question. She picked up the axe and went to split kindling, because kindling was a problem she could solve in the next 5 minutes, and the roof was a problem she could not solve at all. Not yet. Not the way Phelps meant. But Phelps's words stayed. They hung in the cabin like stove smoke on a still morning. Snow falls light. Fear makes it heavy. Beret had heard men say things like that before. In Minnesota, in Wisconsin, in Norway. Confident men, experienced men, men who measured the world by what they had already seen and declared the measurement complete. Her father had been a different kind of man. He had measured the world by what the stones remembered. The first wet snow came in October, 3 weeks after the burial. It was wrong. Everyone in Kettle Creek said so. Too early, too heavy, too wet for the season. The flakes fell fat and slow, like clumps of raw wool, and they stuck to everything they touched. Sleeves, wagon canvas, bare branches, the flat edge of every eave in town. By midday, the roofs carried a layer thick as a man's hand, sodden and gray, and men who had not thought about their roofs since spring climbed ladders and scraped the load off with shovels and brooms. Beret did not climb anything. She stood at the edge of her claim where the land dipped toward a shallow depression below a glacial ridge and watched the snow do what wet snow does. It slid off the ridge face in a slow sheet. It packed into the depression. It did not blow. It did not drift in the way Phelps meant when he said drifts can be managed. It sat. Marte came outside and looked at the snow collecting in the low ground. "It looks like bread dough," she said. Beret stared at the depression. She stared at the ridge above it. She stared at the way the wet snow packed against the natural curve of the ground and held its shape instead of spreading. She thought about her father's sheepfold. The sheepfold had stood on a hillside in western Norway for longer than anyone in the valley could remember. It was not tall. It was not pretty. It was a curved wall of dry-laid stone, built without mortar, leaning inward so that the weight of the earth behind it pressed the stones tighter instead of pushing them apart. Spring thaw sent water against it every year. Snow piled on it every winter. The wall stood because it did not fight the weight. It carried it. Beret remembered standing beside her father during a spring thaw when she was younger than Marte. He had placed her palm flat against the cold stone. She could feel the wall leaning into the hill. He pulled one loose stone from the face and showed her the hollow behind it, a gap where air moved and water drained through broken rock. "A wall breathes or it dies," he had said. "If you trap the water, the ice will split the stone from inside. If you let the water through, the wall drinks and stays." She had filed that memory the way a child files most adult lessons, without understanding, trusting that the understanding would come when it was needed. It was needed now. Beret went inside and found a flower board. She carried it to the depression with a handful of flat stones from the creek bank. Marte followed because Marte always followed. Beret placed 2 stones on the ground, spaced a foot apart, and laid the flat board across them. She scooped wet snow onto the board and pressed it down. The board bowed. She added more snow. The board cracked at the center and the wet load slumped through. Then she gathered more stones. She arranged them in a shallow curve, each stone leaning slightly inward against the next, and packed mud and sod behind the curve. She laid the same board across the top of the little arch and loaded the wet snow again. The arch held. She added more snow, pressed it down. The stones shifted a fraction, settled, and stopped. The curve carried the weight downward through the stones and into the ground. The board did not crack. Marte laughed. It was the first time she had laughed since the funeral, and the sound was so unexpected that Beret looked up as if a bird had spoken. "It is not a real building," Beret said, already thinking past the model. "But it held," Marte said. "It held." Beret looked at the half-finished cabin. She looked at the cottonwood roof poles. She looked at the ridge, the depression, the wet snow packing itself into the curve of the land. And she saw something that Orrin Phelps, with all his army training and Dakota experience, had never needed to see because he had never built in a country where the snow fell like mortar and the only walls that survived were the ones that leaned into the weight instead of standing proud against it. She could not fix the roof. She did not have lumber for a steep pitch, money for boards, or time to rebuild what Torbjorn had started. The cottonwood poles were what she had, and the flat sod roof was what she could finish. But she could build a wall around the problem. Not a wall, a passage. A curved stone corridor in front of the cabin, following the natural contour of the depression, shaped like a broad horseshoe. Stone and earth and sod, dry laid the way her father's sheepfold had been laid, leaning inward so the weight pressed the structure tighter. The passage would shield the cabin entrance from direct wind and direct snow load. It would create a buffer of still air between the outside and the stove. It would carry the weight of snow on its back and shed it into the ground, not onto the cottonwood poles that could not bear it. The design took shape in her mind the way designs do for people who have watched structures stand and fall their whole lives, not as a drawing, but as a feeling. About 42 feet along the curve, 4 feet wide inside, enough to stack firewood and move a child through without turning sideways. 6 feet high at the center, enough to stand. Walls 4 feet thick at the base, narrowing upward. Dry fieldstone with inward lean, sod and earth over the top. The critical insight was this: the snow would still come. The weight would still press. But instead of pressing on thin cottonwood poles over a sleeping child, it would press on stone and earth that were built to receive it. The same snow that could crush a flat timber roof would lie harmless on a curved stone back, and the weight would travel down through the walls into the frozen ground where weight belonged. It was not a fortress. It was a door that could carry a mountain on its shoulders. Beret looked at her hands, swollen knuckles, split skin along the right thumb where the axe handle had worn through her callus. These hands had to move several hundred stones, each one chosen, placed, and fitted before the first hard freeze, with a lame ox, with a 9-year-old helper, with 1.5 cords of wood and $11 and $28 of debt, and a community that already thought she was half mad with grief. "Marte," she said, "get the hammer." Peter Hoagland arrived 2 days later, not to help but to reason. Hoagland was 41, Norwegian like Beret, but a generation younger and a disposition steadier. He farmed the next quarter section west, kept his fences tight, his sod roof patched, and his opinions close. He was not cruel. He was practical in the way that practical people become when they live in a place that punishes impracticality with death. He found Beret on her knees in the depression, sorting field stones into 2 piles. One pile she kept, the other she rolled aside. Marte sat on a flat rock with a flour sack notebook, making marks Hoagland could not read. "Beret," he said, "what are you doing?" "Sorting stone." "I can see that. Why?" Beret picked up a stone the size of a bread loaf and struck it once with a hammer. It gave a dull, solid thud. She placed it on the keep pile. She picked up another, struck it, and heard a thin ring. She rolled it aside. "That one sounded fine," Hoagland said. "It has a crack inside. It will split when the water gets in and freezes." Hoagland looked at the 2 piles, then at the marked curve Beret had scored in the dirt with a stick. He looked at the cabin. He looked back at the curve. "You are building a wall." "A passage around the front of the cabin." "Out of fieldstone." "Yes." "Before winter." "Yes." Hoagland took off his hat and rubbed his head. He was trying to be kind, which made the doubt worse because it was honest. "Beret, how many cords have you cut since Torbjörn died?" "None. I've been sorting stone." "You have 1.5 cords, maybe less." "I know what I have." "Stone does not keep a child warm." Beret placed another stone. Thud. Keep pile. Another stone. Ring. Reject. "No," she said, "but it keeps the roof from coming down on her." Hoagland did not have an answer to that because the answer required imagining a roof collapse, and no practical man in Kettle Creek imagined roof collapse. They imagined hard winters. They imagined low fuel. They imagined hunger, cold, isolation, illness, all the conventional killers of the plains. A roof coming down was not in the catalog of fears because every roof they had built was good enough, and good enough was the standard that had kept them alive so far. Beret was not building against conventional fears. She was building against a fear that no one in Kettle Creek had met yet, because the winter that would bring it had not arrived. Hoagland put his hat back on. "Cut hay," he said. "Stack fuel. Move into town for the worst storms. That is how people survive here." "I cannot leave the claim." "For a few weeks." "I cannot leave the claim, Peter. Vale holds $28 on me. If I leave, he will say I abandoned improvement. The land office will hear what he wants them to hear." Hoagland knew this was true. He also knew there was nothing he could do about it that did not involve money or risk, and he had little of either to spare. He looked at Marta, who was still marking stones in her notebook, and his face did something complicated. "I will bring you a ham," he said. "Sunniva has extra." "I do not need—" "You need a ham, Beret. Take the ham." He left. Beret watched him go, then picked up another stone, struck it, and listened. The mockery began at Vale's store, as most things in Kettle Creek did. Addison Vale was 48, with a shopkeeper's body, soft in the middle, hard in the eyes, and a shopkeeper's understanding of leverage. He owned the only store between the creek and the railroad. He sold lumber, nails, flour, lamp oil, salt pork, coffee, and tobacco on credit to families who would pay after harvest. And when harvest failed, he bought their claims at a fraction of filing cost. He had acquired 4 quarter sections this way in 6 years. Each one had a spring, a timber stand, or access to the wagon trace. Beret's claim had all 3. Vale did not need Beret to fail. He simply knew she would, and he intended to be holding the note when she did. "Beret Kvama," Vale told the men gathered around his stove, "is building a road for ghosts. No living woman needs a stone hallway to get to her own door." The men laughed because Vale expected laughter, and because the image was genuinely absurd. A cabin so small it barely deserved a front step, and a woman building a corridor around it like a castle wall. The work looked insane from any angle that did not include the specific knowledge Beret carried, and no one in the store had that knowledge. The phrase spread. Road for ghosts. Within a week, Beret's project had a name that was funnier than anything she could say in its defense. Men on horseback detoured past her claim to watch her drag stones on a rawhide sling behind the limping ox. They shook their heads. They reported back to the store. Vale kept a running commentary that served double duty. It entertained his customers, and it isolated Beret from the community help that might have made her work possible. Vale rode out on a Thursday, with 2 customers flanking him like witnesses. He stopped the wagon at the edge of the marked curve and watched Beret set a stone into the first course. She did not look up. "Mrs. Kvame," Vale said, "I have come with an offer." "I did not ask for one. I will take the claim note, all $28 forgiven. You and the girl can stay in the back room behind the store through winter, warm, fed, no stone to carry." Beret set another stone. She had learned the rhythm now. Test with the hammer, listen, place, check the lean, pack mud behind it. Each stone took about 2 minutes. She had laid 14 today. She needed several hundred more. "The back room has no window," Beret said. "It has a stove." "I have a stove." "You have a cracked stove, a lame ox, no fuel, and a hallway to nowhere. I am offering you a winter, Mrs. Kavam. Not charity, a trade." Beret understood the trade. She had understood it before Vale climbed down from his wagon. The back room was warm and windowless, and owned by a man who wanted her 160 acres. Accept the room, leave the claim, and by spring the land office would hear whatever Vale needed them to hear about abandonment and failed improvement. The claim would pass to Vale for the cost of $28 in forgiven credit. He would own the ridge, the spring, the stone, and the wagon trace access, and Beret would own a winter's worth of gratitude to a man who never forgot a debt. "No," Beret said. Vale pointed at the stone curve. 4 feet of foundation laid on one side, bare dirt on the other. A structure that looked less like shelter and more like the beginning of something that would never be finished. "No buyer pays for a buried door," Vale said. "Then do not buy it," Beret said. Vale climbed back onto the wagon. He smiled the way a man smiles when the trap is set and the animal is walking toward it on schedule. "December," he said to his companions, loud enough for Beret to hear. "She will come to me by December." Beret placed another stone. Thud. Keep. Community gossip did what gossip does. It filled the spaces where help might have lived. Women who might have brought food stayed away because association with foolishness was its own kind of debt in a small settlement. Men who might have carried a few stones on their way past found reasons to take a different trail. Beret and Marte worked alone in the depression below the ridge, and the work was visible enough for everyone in Kettle Creek to judge and incomplete enough for everyone to be right. Peter Hauglin tried once more. He came on a Sunday, which was the day he tried to be something better than practical. He stood at the edge of the marked curve and watched Beret fitting stones into the second course. Her hands were wrapped in strips of wool blanket. The wrapping on her right hand was spotted with blood. "Beret," he said, "the passage is not finished. Your woodpile is low. Your hands are swelling. The ox is lame. You have one girl and no help and a debt you cannot service. I am not mocking you. I am counting. I know how to count. Then count this. The first real cold comes in 5 weeks, maybe 6. You cannot finish this stone in 5 weeks. I do not need to finish it in 5 weeks. I need to finish enough." "Enough for what?" Beret straightened. Her back had been bent over stones for hours, and straightening cost her a sound she did not want Marte to hear. "Enough so the weight goes through stone instead of through cottonwood. Enough so the entry does not open into the wind. Enough so one armload of wood lasts longer than it does now. I am not building a castle, Peter. I am building a door that does not die when the snow leans on it." Hoagland looked at the first course of stone. It was, he had to admit, well laid. The stones fit tightly. The curve followed the contour of the ground. The base was wider than he expected, thick enough that it looked less like a wall and more like the foundation of a bridge abutment. But foundations are not roofs, and Winter was not interested in foundations. "If you are wrong," he said, "Marte pays." He left. Beret watched him go and did not answer, because the answer was that he was right, and she knew it, and the knowing changed nothing. Marte would pay if Beret was wrong. Marte would also pay if Beret did nothing, because doing nothing meant a flat cottonwood roof and a cracked stove and 1.5 cords of wood and a winter that had not yet shown its intentions. The difference was that doing nothing guaranteed the debt. Building the passage was a bet, against time, against her body, against the opinions of everyone who had survived Dakota winters before her and believed that survival entitled them to define the only way it could be done. Beret picked up the hammer. She struck a stone. Thud. She placed it. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever built something people mocked because they could not see what it was for yet? The next morning she started before dawn, working by lantern light. The stones were cold enough to stick to wet skin. She learned to keep her wrappings dry and to breathe away from the work so her breath would not frost the stone faces. Marte carried the smaller stones from the creek bank in a canvas sling, making 6 trips before breakfast. Burnt the ox dragged the larger ones on the rawhide until his shoulder swelled so badly that Beret unhitched him and let him stand in the lee of the cabin eating the last of the hay she could not afford to spare. After that, she and Marte moved every stone by hand. The first course was the heaviest labor. Each foundation stone weighed as much as Marte, and some weighed more. Beret levered them with a cottonwood pole, rolled them on smaller stones, and dropped them into the shallow trench she had dug below the frost-softened topsoil. The trench was only 8 inches deep, but digging it with a broken-handled spade had taken 2 full days. She laid the first course wider than her spread hand on both sides of the marked curve, leaving small gaps every few feet where water could weep through the base instead of collecting and freezing inside the wall. By the end of the first week, she had 12 feet of first course laid along the curve, 42 feet total, 12 done, 30 to go, and that was only the first course. The wall needed 4 feet of height at the sides and 6 at the center, with each course stepping inward to form the core-belled roof. She had built a fraction of a fraction. October was burning away. The daylight hours shortened by minutes she could feel. Mornings came gray and late. Evenings fell early, stealing the last hour of work that had been the most productive because the stones were warmest then from a full day of thin sun. Frost appeared on the ground by mid-month, and Beret learned that frozen ground was harder to dig, but frozen mud packed better behind the stones. A night freeze heaved one unfinished section outward. 3 stones shifted. The lean reversed. What had been a wall leaning inward became a wall leaning outward, which was not a wall at all but a pile waiting to fall. Beret spent a full day tearing down 6 feet of first and second course and relaying them, tamping the earth behind each stone until her arms shook. Marte kept her notebook. She recorded the number of stones laid each day, the weather, and the height of the wall at 3 points along the curve. She did this without being asked because Marte was the kind of child who understood that counting was a form of hope. 12 feet, then 15, then 19. The stone rose. The days shortened. The ox limped. The woodpile did not grow. And Beret's hands bled through the wrappings, and she did not stop, because stopping was a luxury that belonged to people who had choices, and Beret Kavama had exactly one choice left: build the thing that no one believed in, or sit in a half-roofed cabin and wait for the weight of a winter she could already feel pressing down from a sky that had not yet decided how much it intended to deliver. The stones did not care about opinions. They only cared about placement, and Beret placed them, one by one, while the town watched and laughed and waited for December. The man appeared on a morning when Beret was rejecting stones. She had developed a system by the 3rd week of October. Every stone got the hammer test. A solid thud meant dense grain, no internal fractures, no hidden seams where water could enter and freeze and split the stone apart from inside. A thin ring meant a crack somewhere in the body, invisible maybe, but fatal in a freeze-thaw cycle. Ring stones went to the drainage trench she was digging along the uphill side of the curve. Thud stones went to the wall. She was crouched over a flat stone the size of a saddle seat, turning it to find the striking point when a voice behind her said, "You passed over an easy one." Beret did not turn. She struck the flat stone. Thud. She placed it on the keep pile. "The one before it," the voice said. "Wide, even face. Would have saved you 10 minutes of fitting." Now she turned. The man was old, 65 at least, maybe older, with a frame that had once been broad and was now settling inward the way old timber settles. His left eye was clouded to the color of creek ice. He wore a coat that had been patched at both elbows and a hat that belonged to a younger decade. He was leaning on a walking stick that was not decorative. "It would split," Beret said. "Why?" "It rang thin on the left side. The grain changes where the color shifts. Water gets in at the seam." The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked, slowly, with the stick bearing real weight, to the rejected stone and picked it up. He turned it in his hands. He found the color shift and pressed his thumbnail into the seam. A flake of stone came away. "You're right," he said. "Bad stone." He set it down. "Who taught you to listen?" "My father, in Norway." "Your father built in stone?" "Sheepfolds, field walls, a root cellar that outlived him." The man looked at the foundation course, 12 feet of curve rising from the trench. He walked along it, touching stones the way a man touches something he recognizes. His good eye moved from stone to stone, reading the joints, the lean, the placement. He stopped where the second course began and ran his finger along the gap between 2 face stones. "Your face is too straight," he said. Beret stiffened. She had been proud of the face. It was even tight, clean, the kind of wall face her father would have approved. "A wall that stands proud wants to fall," the man said. He held his walking stick against the wall face and showed her. The stones were nearly vertical. "A wall that leans a little is thinking. It leans into the hill, and the hill leans back, and between them, nothing moves." "Batter," Beret said. She knew the word. She had seen it in her father's walls, but had not measured it. 1 inch per foot of rise, maybe a little more at the base where the weight stacks. You build straight, the first good freeze will heave you outward, and you start over. You build with batter, the freeze pushes, and the wall tightens. Beret looked at the 12 feet of foundation she had already laid. Some of it was straight. Some of it had natural lean from the ground contour. None of it had been measured to a deliberate batter. "How much do I tear down?" she asked. The man walked the foundation again. "Most of the second course. The first course can stay. It is wide enough to forgive, but the second course sets the angle, and your angle is wrong." Beret closed her eyes. 2 weeks of work on the second course. Stones placed, packed, fitted. Her hands had bled for those stones. "Who are you?" she said. "Murdoch Canane. I built culverts and bridge abutments for the Northern Pacific in Minnesota, root cellar vaults for homesteaders along the James River, stonework for anyone who paid." He coughed, a deep, wet sound that came from a place in his chest where cold air had lived too long. "I'm mostly retired now. I have a shack at the north end of the creek. I came to see who was making noise with a hammer." "And?" "And you are building a corbelled passage with fieldstone and guts, and no one helping you, and your batter is wrong, and your drainage is in the right place but too shallow, and your through stones are missing entirely." "Through stones?" Murtaugh picked up a long, narrow stone from the reject pile and held it crosswise. "Every 3 feet, maybe 4, you need a stone that goes all the way through the wall, ties the outer face to the inner face. Without them, you have 2 walls standing next to each other pretending to be one wall. First real load, they separate, and the fill between them pushes out like a belly." Beret stared at the wall she had built. She thought about the forces, snow pressing down, earth pressing in, frost heaving up. Without through stones, the 2 faces of her thick wall had nothing holding them together except the mud and rubble packed between them. Myrtle was right. She had been building 2 walls. "I need to tear down the second course," she said. "Yes. That is 2 weeks. It is however long it takes to do it right." Marte appeared at the edge of the work area with a water pail. She looked at the old man with the clouded eye and the walking stick and the coat patched at both elbows, and she looked at her grandmother's face, and she set down the pail without a word. "Are you helping us?" Marty asked. Myrtle looked at the child. He looked at the wall. He looked at Beret's hands, wrapped in bloody wool. He coughed again. "I am correcting your grandmother's batter," he said. "After that, we will see." He stayed. Not because Beret asked. She did not ask, and would not have, but because Murdoch Canane recognized something in the work that he had not seen in years. Competence, not perfection. Competence. The woman was building wrong in specific ways that could be fixed, and she was building right in fundamental ways that could not be taught. She listened to stone. She rejected bad material without hesitation. She understood that a wall was not a stack but a system, even if she did not yet understand all the parts of the system. He taught through work. He never lectured. He picked up a stone, placed it, and said why. He corrected by demonstration, moving a stone Beret had set, showing the gap, replacing it with the proper lean, and stepping back so she could see the difference. He spoke to Marte the same way he spoke to Beret. As a person who was capable of learning if the information was delivered through the hands instead of the mouth. The batter was first. They tore down the second course along the entire 12-foot section and relaid it with a measured lean, 1 inch inward for every foot of rise. Murda showed Beret how to check with a plumb line made from a stone on a string. Hold the string against the wall face. If the stone hangs free at the base, the wall leans in. If the stone touches the face, the wall is standing straight or worse. "Your father knew this," Murtaugh said. "My father did it by eye." "Your father had 50 years of eye. You have 5 weeks. Use the string." The through stones were second. Murtaugh had Beret search the creek bank for long, narrow stones, at least 2.5 feet, long enough to span the full wall thickness. These went in every 3 to 4 feet along the course, tying the inner and outer faces together so the wall breathed as one piece. Setting through stones meant recalculating the fit of every surrounding stone, and some courses had to be partially disassembled and rebuilt around the new bones. The drainage trench was third. Beret had dug a shallow trench along the uphill side of the curve, but Murda said it was too shallow by half. He had her deepen it to 18 inches and fill the bottom 6 inches with broken stone and gravel so water would flow through instead of pooling. "Water is the enemy you do not see," he said. "Cold will test your wall. Wind will test your wall, but water will kill it. Water gets into the stone, freezes, expands, and splits from inside. Your father told you the wall must breathe. The trench is how it breathes. The corbelling was fourth, and it was the lesson that would save them. Each upper course of stone had to step inward slightly, narrowing the gap between the two wall faces until the top could be bridged by capstones and short oak lintels. The stepping had to be gradual, no more than 1.5 inches of overhang per course, or the unsupported weight would pull the stone forward and collapse the upper wall during construction, long before any snow arrived to test it. Patience builds a corbel, Murda said. Ambition collapses one. They worked together through the last weeks of October and into November. The rhythm established itself. Beret and Marte hauled stone from the creek bank and the ridge face. Murdaugh sorted, directed placement, and did the fine fitting that his hands still knew even when his lungs could not sustain heavy lifting. Burnt the ox stood in the lee of the cabin, his shoulder too swollen for dragging, eating hay that Beret could not afford to spare, but could not afford to withhold, because a dead ox in December was worse than a thin one. The wall rose in measured increments, 19 feet of curve, then 23, then 26. Marte kept her notebook current. She recorded height at 5 points along the curve, stone count per day, weather, and a column she labeled M says, Murdaugh's corrections and observations, written in a 9-year-old's handwriting that was neater than most adults. Setbacks came like heartbeats. A night of freezing rain glazed the unfinished upper courses, and Beret had to chip ice from every stone face before laying the next course, losing a full morning. Vale sent word through a customer that he was cutting off Beret's lamp oil credit, which meant working only in daylight hours that were shrinking by 3 minutes a day. Phelps rode past, stopped, watched for 10 minutes, and said nothing, which was worse than his words, because silence from an authority meant the verdict had not changed, but the interest in delivering it had faded. The unexpected help came from where Beret did not expect it. Sunniva Haugland, Pater's wife, arrived one afternoon with bread and a jar of rendered fat. She said nothing about the stone. She set the food on the cabin step, looked at the rising wall, and then, without asking, without announcement, picked up a stone the size of a turnip and carried it to the base of the curve. She stayed for 2 hours. She carried small stones. She did not speak about what she was doing because speaking about it would have required defending it to Pater, and Sunniva had decided to help before deciding how to explain it. She came back 3 more times over the next 2 weeks, always with food, always carrying stones for an hour or two before leaving. Pater found out. He did not stop her. He was embarrassed, but he was also Norwegian, and Norwegian embarrassment operates at a depth that does not always reach the surface. He said nothing to Beret. He said nothing to Sunniva. He looked at the rising wall from the trail and kept riding. Beret's hand split along both thumbs and across the backs of 3 fingers. She packed the cracks with tallow and wrapped them in wool strips and kept working because the alternative to working was not working, and not working meant the wall stayed unfinished, and an unfinished corbelled passage was not a shelter. It was a monument to intention. By mid-November, the foundation and lower courses ran the full 42 feet of the curve. The upper courses were complete along 28 feet. The remaining 14 feet, including the most critical section over the cabin entrance, were 3 courses short of capstone height. Murda estimated 4 more days of good weather. The weather did not offer 4 days, it offered 2. By late November, the passage was complete enough to enter but not beautiful. The capstones were set. The oak lintels, salvaged from an abandoned freight platform that Murdaugh had remembered from his railroad days, dragged 3 miles on a borrowed sledge, bridged the widest gaps where corbelling alone could not close the roof. Sodden earth covered the top in a lumpy, uneven layer that looked less like construction and more like the hill had swallowed the front of the cabin. From a distance, the claim looked wrong. The cabin was still visible from the back and sides, small, rough, ordinary, but the front had vanished into a mound of earth and stone that curved away from the doorway like a buried arm reaching into the depression. The entry to the passage opened on the leeward side, facing away from the prevailing wind, through a gap that Murdaugh had framed with the 2 largest stones Beret owned, each one dragged into place by Beret, Marte, and Murtaugh together, using the rawhide sling and wooden rollers and a vocabulary of Norwegian and Irish profanity that Marte recorded faithfully in her notebook. Inside, the corridor smelled of damp earth, cold rock, and smoke from the cabin stove that leaked through the connecting doorway. The walls were rough, fieldstone faces uncut, fitted by shape rather than dressed to flatness. But the lean was visible. The through-stones protruded slightly at regular intervals like the ribs of an animal. The floor was packed earth, dry enough to sleep on if a person laid a blanket down. Beret tested it. She piled sod on the capstones until the load matched what she estimated a heavy snowfall would deliver. She shoveled wet earth. She hauled buckets of water and poured them over the mound to simulate meltwater. Murdaugh made her listen. A failing wall speaks, he told her. Clicks. Dust sifting from joints. The sound of a stone shifting against its neighbor. A healthy wall under load says nothing. The corridor said nothing. The controlled tests continued. Inside the passage, a water pail skinned over with ice, but did not freeze solid overnight. Inside the cabin, with the passage blocking direct wind from the entry, the cracked stove drew more evenly and the heat held longer. Marte measured it her own way. She counted how long one armload of wood kept the cabin warm enough to read by. Before the passage, one armload lasted about 2 hours. After, nearly 3. A third more heat from the same wood, not because the stove had changed, but because the wind had lost its path to the fire. Phelps came to look. He brought a lantern even though it was midday, and he used it to examine the inner wall face, the capstones, the lintels, the drainage trench visible through the entry gap. He said the work was adequate. From Phelps, this was nearly praise, but he followed it immediately with the assessment that mattered. A small snowfall proves nothing, Phelps said. This has held a few inches. Winter is not a few inches. No, Beret said. It is not. If the load exceeds what the stone can carry, the corbel fails inward. You understand that. The ceiling comes down on whoever is inside. The ceiling is stone. Stone does not come down the way timber comes down. If a capstone shifts, it shifts slowly. There is time to move. Phelps looked at Murdaugh, who was sitting on a stone outside the entry, coughing into a rag. And this man told you it would hold? Murdaugh answered without standing. I told her how to build it so it could hold. Whether it holds is between the stone and the snow. I do not speak for either. Phelps left. He had nothing else to say that he had not already said. His verdict was still the same. Flat roofs, shoveled regularly, were the tested method. Beret's stone corridor was an experiment built by a foreign widow and a half-blind Irish mason, and experiments in Dakota Territory were measured in bodies. Vail said the structure might stand but would bury them alive. He said this loudly at the store, where it would be repeated. The image was vivid and useful, a woman and a child sealed inside a stone tomb by the very snow the stones were meant to carry. It was the kind of story that people repeated, not because they believed it, but because it sounded true enough to excuse their inaction. Peter Haugland admitted the entry was warmer. He had come to see for himself, and the difference in wind at the cabin door was obvious, even to a man who did not want to be convinced. But he still thought the town cabins were safer, because people could reach one another. You are alone out here, he said. If something goes wrong, who comes? Beret had no answer. She was alone. The nearest neighbor was Pater, a quarter-mile west. The town was a mile and a half south. In a bad storm, a mile and a half might as well be 100. November ended. December began. The temperature dropped, but the snow held off, dry, light, blowing powder that drifted against fences and swept clear of roofs. Exactly the snow Phelps had described. Exactly the snow that made Beret look wrong and made the stone passage look like a waste of weeks that could have been spent cutting fuel. Beret watched the sky. She felt the air. Something was wrong with December. The cold was real, but the dryness was temporary. She had seen this pattern in Minnesota, a long, cold, dry stretch that felt like the winter settling in, followed by a shift in the wind and a sudden massive dump of wet snow that caught everyone leaning the wrong way. She saw ice glaze on the underside of eaves in town, meltwater from the stove heat inside, refreezing on the cold outer surface of the roof boards. A small thing, an invisible thing, but it meant the roof surfaces were cold enough to bond with whatever fell on them next. She told Phelps. He listened without expression and said early ice was normal. She told Pater. He said she was seeing Norway and Dakota again. She told no one else, because no one else was listening. Myrtle listened. He sat in the passage on a flat stone he had claimed as his seat, with a cup of broth Marty had brought him, and he coughed and nodded. "When the wet one comes," he said, "it will come fast, and it will not stop when people want it to." "How do you know?" "Because I have been breathing this air for a week, and it tastes like the air before a bridge flood. Heavy, patient, waiting for permission." Beret looked at her woodpile. She had managed to cut and haul another cord and a half during the weeks of construction, working in stolen hours before dawn and after the last stone was placed each day. 3 cords total now. Still half of what Phelps said she needed, but the passage cut her wood consumption by a third, so 3 cords inside the passage might last as long as 4.5 without it. Might. The math was still dangerous. Everything about this winter was still dangerous. The only thing that had changed was the shape of the danger, from certain failure to possible survival, balanced on a curve of fieldstone, and the judgment of a woman who listened to snow the way her father had listened to walls. The storm came on a night in mid-December. It began wrong. Not bitter powder. Not the dry, blowing snow that Phelps had promised and December had delivered. This was different. The flakes fell heavy, wet, near freezing, fat plates of snow that stuck to everything and slid off nothing. They landed on sleeves and did not blow away. They landed on wagon canvas and sagged it. They landed on roofs and stayed. Beret heard it before she saw it. The sound of wet snow hitting the stone passage was different from dry snow. Dry snow hissed, wet snow thumped. Each flake carried weight, and weight has a sound, a soft, insistent percussion like a hand pressing down on a drumhead. She went to the passage entry and looked out. The sky was not visible. The air was white. The flakes were so thick and so large that the lantern light could not penetrate more than a few feet beyond the entry gap. The temperature was hovering just below freezing, warm enough to keep the snow wet, cold enough to start bonding it once it settled. Mortar snow. Beret pulled Marte away from the entry and told her to stay inside the cabin. She checked the stovepipe. The rear pipe, which vented through the back wall of the cabin above the passage roof, was still clear. The front entry to the passage was the vulnerable point. If wet snow sealed the entry, ventilation would depend entirely on the rear pipe and the small weep gaps in the stone base. By the time Beret finished checking the stove, the entry gap was half blocked by accumulating snow. She cleared it with a grain scoop. An hour later, it was blocked again. The snow was not drifting in the conventional sense. It was falling straight down and sticking where it landed, building a wall of wet weight across the opening. In Kettle Creek, the first roofs began to groan. The sound carried because the air was dense and wet, and sound moves through wet air the way water moves through sand, slowly, completely. A groan from a roof beam is unmistakable. It is the sound of wood bending past the point where bending is healthy, into the range where the next sound is a crack. Men climbed onto their roofs with shovels. They shoveled the wet snow off one side, and it piled against the wall below. They shoveled the other side, and it piled on the other wall. The snow refilled the roof faster than they could clear it, because the snowfall was not a squall or a burst, but a system. Wide, deep, and patient, with hours of moisture behind it. By midnight, the wet snow had laid down a base layer thick enough that the cold air above it began to harden the surface. The snow did exactly what Beret had described to Phelps months ago. The first wet layer bonded to the roof surface. It froze. The second layer of wet snow fell on the frozen first layer and bonded to that, mortar on mortar. Each layer locked to the one below it, and the combined weight grew not by addition, but by multiplication, because wet snow bonded to ice weighs more than wet snow alone. Barrett sealed the passage entry from inside. She packed snow against the gap deliberately, creating an insulating plug that would prevent wind from driving more snow into the corridor. The rear stovepipe drew cleanly. The passage was dark, close, and warmer than any standing cabin in town. Marte's fever came at the worst possible moment. The child had been coughing for 2 days, a dry, shallow cough that Beret had attributed to the cold air and the stone dust from weeks of construction. But by midnight of the first storm night, the cough turned wet, and Marte's forehead was hot enough to feel through a wool sleeve. Beret moved her onto the sleeping platform inside the cabin, closest to the stove, and covered her with every blanket they owned. She could not leave to get help. Even if she could dig out the entry, the town was 1.5 miles south, through snow that was falling so thick a lantern could not light the next step. Marte's fever was Beret's to manage alone, with broth, with warmth, with the herbs she had dried in October and hung from the cabin rafters. Murdo arrived an hour before dawn. He had walked from his shack at the north end of the creek, 1/2 mile through waist-deep snow in the dark, with one good eye and a cough that rattled his whole frame. He came through the side of the passage where the snow had not yet sealed, crawling the last 10 feet on his hands and knees through a gap between the drift and the stone wall. Beret heard him before she saw him, the coughing, unmistakable, echoing through the stone corridor like a voice in a well. "You should not have come," she said. "I wanted to hear the stones when the sky leaned on them," he said. She pulled him inside. He was soaked through. His clouded eye had frozen tears along the lashes. She sat him near the stove and gave him broth, and did not say anything else about his coming, because the truth was she needed him, and saying so would have changed the nature of what he had done from a choice to an obligation. Murtaugh listened. He pressed his palm flat against the inner wall of the passage and closed his good eye. "What do you hear?" Beret asked. "Nothing," he said. "Nothing is the right answer." The stones held. The second day was worse. The snow did not stop. It changed, slightly warmer, slightly wetter, falling in clumps now instead of individual flakes. The clumps hit the passage roof with sounds that Beret could feel through the stone. Each impact was small. The accumulation was not. By mid-morning, the passage was invisible from outside. The entry gap was sealed. The leeward side, where Murtaugh's had crawled through, was sealed. The stovepipe protruded from the mound like a single finger pointing at a sky that had forgotten what it was doing. Inside, the temperature held. The stone and earth absorbed the cold from the snow above and radiated a stable, deep chill that was uncomfortable but not dangerous. 35 degrees, Beret estimated, in the passage itself. Inside the cabin, with the stove fed, it held above 40. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, stone dust, and the sour sweetness of Marte's fever sweat. Marte drifted in and out of sleep. Murdo drifted in and out of coughing. Beret drifted into the focused calm of a woman who had run out of fear and arrived at the place beyond it where the only thing left was action. She kept the stove fed. Small pieces, slow burn, stretching the wood. She kept Marte's forehead cool, with water wrung from a cloth. She kept the rear stovepipe clear by tapping it from inside with a pole and listening for the sound of falling snow from the outside opening. In Kettle Creek, the sounds changed. Phelps's shed went first. The roof was flat pine boards over cottonwood poles, the same construction he had recommended to every homesteader in the settlement. The wet snow load exceeded the bearing capacity of the center pole at approximately 10 in the morning, and the pole snapped with a sound that Phelps later said reminded him of a rifle shot. The roof came down on the left side, killing a milk cow instantly and catching his hired boy, Asa, under a section of boards. Phelps dug the boy out with his bare hands. Asa's arm was broken at the elbow, and his scalp was opened from temple to ear. Phelps carried the boy to the main cabin and set the arm with splints and linen and sat in the dark, listening to his own roof creak. Vale's store suffered next. The store roof was the best in Kettle Creek, milled lumber, proper pitch, tar paper, and iron nails. But it had been built for dry snow loads, not for the wet concrete that was accumulating on every flat and shallow surface in the settlement. By noon, the center beam of the store bowed visibly. Vale sent every man he could find onto the roof with shovels, and they cleared the store first, all right, before the schoolhouse, before the church frame, before any family cabin. Vale's goods were insured by their irreplaceability. Nobody else's home was insured by anything except the beams that held them. Peter Haugland's cabin cracked along the center ridge beam at 2 in the afternoon. The crack ran the full length of the beam and opened a gap in the sod roof wide enough to admit snow. Peter braced the beam with every piece of timber he could find inside the cabin, a chair, a table leg, the frame of a bed, and told Sunniva to take the children and crawl out through the east window. Sunniva Haugland carried her baby against her chest and held her 4-year-old son by the hand and crawled through a window into waist-deep snow with no destination except away from the sound her roof was making. She reached the store, which was still standing only because 6 men had been shoveling it continuously. Peter stayed behind to brace the beam. Jabez Crowell, 71, a bachelor who lived in a lean-to he had built against a creek bank, was not found until the 3rd day. The lean-to had collapsed under the wet snow load sometime during the first night. Crowell was beneath it. He had been dead for many hours by the time men reached him. The snow above his body had frozen into a solid mass that required an axe to break. This was the winter that Beret had described. This was the mortar snow. This was the weight that Phelps had said fell light and fear made heavy. It was not fear that made it heavy. It was water. Phelps reached Beret's claim on the evening of the 2nd day. He had walked 1.5 miles through drifts that reached his chest in places, with frost in his beard, and blood on his sleeve from the hired boy's wound, and the raw blisters on his palms from shoveling. He had not slept. He had not eaten since a piece of hardtack that morning. He stood on the ridge above the depression and looked down at Beret's claim. The cabin was barely visible. The passage was invisible, a long, curved mound of white that looked like a natural feature of the landscape. The only sign of life was the stovepipe, pushing smoke into the falling snow. Phelps cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted. Inside the passage, Beret heard him. The sound came through the stone and earth as a muffled vibration, directionless, human. Murdo heard it too. "Someone is outside," he said. Beret went to the sealed entry. She could hear Phelps's voice now. Not the words, but the tone. It was not the tone of a man delivering advice. It was the tone of a man asking for help. She could not open the entry. The snow had packed against it into a solid wall of wet weight, bonded and frozen, exactly the mortar she had predicted. Digging straight up through the load would risk breaking the packed shell that was distributing weight evenly across the capstones. Murdaugh told her what she already knew: dig sideways, not up. Find the leeward drift where the snow was deepest but least bonded, and tunnel through it horizontally. She dug with a grain scoop and a broken washboard. Marte could not help. The fever had weakened her enough that standing made her dizzy. Murtaugh could not help. His coughing was continuous now, and his hands shook too badly to grip a tool. Beret dug alone. It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of wet snow in her face, snow in her sleeves, snow melting against her skin and refreezing as she worked. She broke through the drift into open air, or what passed for open air, which was a wall of falling snow only slightly less dense than the drift she had dug through. Phelps was standing 6 feet from the hole she had made. He looked at her face emerging from the snowbank, and for a moment his expression contained something Beret had never seen in it before. Not respect exactly, recognition. 3 families, Phelps said. His voice was hoarse. Haugland's beam cracked. Sunniva and the children are at the store, but the store is bowing. My boy Asa has a broken arm. 2 other cabins are leaking through the roof cracks. Crowell is not answering. He did not ask permission. He did not apologize. He said, "Can this hold more?" Beret looked at the mound behind her, the stone passage buried under several feet of wet snow, carrying the weight on its curved back exactly as she had designed it. The snow that had crushed timber lay harmless on the stone. The curve distributed the load downward through the walls and into the frozen ground. The earth cover insulated. The drainage trench carried meltwater away from the base. Bring them, Beret said. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because what happens next decides whether the stone passage becomes a refuge or a grave. They came in through the tunnel, Sunniva first, with the baby held inside her coat and the 4-year-old clinging to her back. Then Petter, who had given up the bracing fight when the second crack opened along his ridge beam and the sod started falling inward. Then Phelps's hired boy, Asa, cradled between two men Beret did not know, his splinted arm held against his chest, and his face the gray-white of someone who has lost enough blood to make the world tilt. Then 3 more, a family from the south end of Kettle Creek, whose names Beret had heard but never learned. A man, a woman, and a boy of 12 who was carrying a cast-iron skillet as if it were the only possession worth saving from a collapsing house. 11 people inside a stone passage built for 3. The corridor was 42 feet long, 4 feet wide, 6 feet high at the center. Beret organized it the way a captain organizes a lifeboat, by need, not by preference. Children in the cabin, closest to the stove. Injured adults in the corridor, where the stable temperature would keep them from shivering without overheating. Healthy adults near the tunnel mouth, ready to clear it if the snow shifted. Marte lay on the sleeping platform with Sunniva's baby beside her. The baby had stopped crying, which worried Sunniva more than the crying had. Marte's fever had broken slightly. The broth and herbs were working, or the fever was running its course, or both. She watched the baby with the serious attention of a child who understands that being sick does not excuse her from being useful. Murda sat on his flat stone in the corridor and coughed and watched the walls. "Listen," he told Beret. "If the stones speak, we move everyone to the cabin and brace the connecting door." The stones did not speak. The passage groaned once, a low, deep sound that traveled through the floor and up through the walls and made every adult in the corridor go silent. Beret put her hand on the wall. She felt the vibration settle. She felt the stones tighten against each other as the load above pressed down and the lean carried the weight inward and downward through the through stones and the base courses and into the frozen ground. "That is the wall taking weight," Myrta said. "That is what it is supposed to do." Phelps was crouched near the tunnel mouth, his lantern throwing shadows on the rough stone face. He had been inside for 10 minutes and had not spoken since entering. Now he stood and walked the length of the corridor, slowly, touching the wall the way he had touched Beret's cabin framing months ago, assessing, measuring, reading. He stopped at a through stone that protruded slightly from the inner face. He pressed his palm against it. The stone was cold. It was dry. It was not moving. He looked up at the capstones and the oak lintels above his head, the ceiling that should have failed, the ceiling that every principle he had built his career on said should have failed under this load, the ceiling that was holding because the woman who built it had understood something about weight and stone and curves that Phelps, with his army training and his 11 years of Dakota building, had never needed to understand because he had never faced the snow that required it. He said nothing. His silence filled the corridor more completely than any words could have. Sunniva looked at Phelps, and then at Beret, and then at the walls, and understood that the silence was an admission that the man who had said, "Snowfall's light," was standing inside the proof that he was wrong. The night passed. The snow continued. The stove burned slowly. The passage held. In the morning, when the snowfall thinned enough to see the ridge above, Beret dug a fresh tunnel through the drift. She emerged into a Kettle Creek that looked like it had been pressed flat by a hand from the sky. Rooflines sagged. Chimneys leaned. The store had lost a section of its back wall where the snow load had pushed the frame sideways. Smoke holes were buried under white mounds that showed no sign of the structures beneath them. Beret's claim looked like a hill. The passage was invisible. The cabin was invisible. The stovepipe stood alone in a field of white, breathing smoke into still air. Behind her, inside the stone and earth, 11 people were alive because a woman who listened to snow had built a door that the snow could not crush. The storm broke on the 3rd morning, not with sunlight, but with silence. The snow stopped falling and the air went still, and the cold that followed was the real cold. the dry, bitter, bone-reaching cold that Dakota had been saving behind the wet curtain. The temperature dropped below zero and kept dropping, and the wet snow that had fallen as mortar now froze into a solid mass that would not move until spring decided to move it. Beret counted heads. 11 people inside the passage and cabin. 1 dead. Crowell confirmed when 2 men reached his lean-to on the 4th day and came back without speaking. Several cabins damaged. The store still standing, but weakened. Phelps's shed gone. Hoglin's cabin open to the sky along the ridge crack. The town had survived. Barely. And it had survived unevenly, some by luck, some by labor, and 11 by the stone passage that Addison Vale had called a road for ghosts. Phelps stayed 3 days after the storm cleared. He said he stayed because Asa needed warmth and stillness for his arm to set properly, and this was true, but he also stayed because he was not finished looking at the walls. On the second morning, when the others had filed out through the tunnel to begin assessing damage, Phelps walked the corridor alone. He carried the lantern low, moving it along the base courses where the through stones tied the inner and outer faces together. He pressed his thumb into the joints between stones, feeling for shift, for moisture, for the fine grit that signals internal movement. He found none. He examined the capstones, the oak lintels, the corbelling, which stepped inward in measured increments, 1.5 inches per course, consistent, patient, exactly the way a bridge abutment narrows toward its keystone. He had built bridge abutments in the army. He knew what disciplined stone looked like. He had not expected to find it here. Beret found him in the corridor, crouched below a through stone, his lantern tilted to cast light into the drainage gap at the base. "The weep gaps," Phelps said. "You left openings at the base for water. Murtaugh taught me. Water trapped inside a wall freezes and splits the stone from within." Murtaugh. "The Irish mason. He corrected my batter and showed me the through stones." Phelps stood. He set the lantern on a flat stone and looked at Beret directly. He was not a man who apologized easily, because apology required admitting a prior error, and prior errors in Phelps's profession were measured in collapsed roofs and broken bones. "I told you snowfall's light," he said. "I was wrong. Not about the snow. About what made it heavy." He paused. "Water made it heavy. You saw the water. I saw the snow." Beret did not gloat. She did not say, "I told you so," or remind him that she had warned him about mortar snow in October, while he had stood in her doorway and dismissed her fears as foreign. She handed him a cup of broth from the pot on the stove and said, "Keep the children awake. Marty's fever broke, but the Hoglin baby is too quiet." Phelps took the broth. He drank it standing in the corridor he had said would bury her alive. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a debt acknowledged and a payment accepted without ceremony. Peter Haugland's conversion was slower and more physical. He came to the passage 4 days after the storm, not to thank Beret, but to examine the wall. Sunniva had told him about the interior, the warmth, the stability, the silence of the stones under load, and Peter was a man who did not trust reports. He trusted his hands. Beret let him in without comment. She watched him walk the corridor the way Phelps had walked it, touching the wall face, pressing joints, testing the lean. He stopped at the section where Sunniva had carried small stones during the October construction. He did not know those were Sunniva's stones. He only knew the fitting was slightly different there, tighter in some places, wider in others, the work of someone learning by doing. "How do I build this for my cabin?" Peter asked. It was not a compliment. It was better. It was a request for knowledge, which meant he had crossed from doubt to acceptance without needing to announce the crossing. Beret showed him. She took him outside, where the mound of snow and earth still covered the passage, and pointed to the curve. She explained the batter, 1 inch of inward lean per foot of rise. She explained the through stones. She crouched at the base and showed him the weep gaps. "You do not need to build this," she said. "You need a stone and sod bank along your entry. 4 feet high, 2 feet thick, curved away from the door. It blocks the wind path to your stove and catches drift before it reaches the roof edge. The snow piles against the bank instead of on the roof. Pater nodded slowly. He was calculating. Beret could see him doing the math. Stone available on his quarter section. Labor hours. How much of the winter remained? And the lean, he said. The lean is the part that matters. The lean is the part that holds. He left and came back the next day with a sledge and an apology that he delivered sideways. The way Norwegian men deliver apologies. Not by saying sorry, but by bringing a quarter cord of split birch and stacking it against Beret's cabin wall without being asked. The measurable results spread through Kettle Creek by word of mouth, which was the only way anything spread in a settlement without a newspaper. The flat-roofed cabins with cottonwood poles and sod cover had either collapsed, bowed to the point of structural failure, or survived only because their occupants had shoveled continuously through a storm that ran for 3 days. Phelps's shed was gone. 2 other outbuildings had caved. Hoglin's cabin needed a new ridge beam and complete re-roofing. The store had lost its back wall section and 300 pounds of flour to moisture. Beret's stone passage had carried the full load of the storm without visible displacement. The capstones had not shifted. The through stones had not separated. The drainage trench had kept meltwater from freezing inside the base. The weep gaps had functioned. The temperature inside the corridor had remained above freezing, cold, uncomfortable, but survivable, while the temperature outside had dropped to 22 below zero on the second night after the storm. People came to look. Not in a group. That would have required someone to organize a visit, and no one in Kettle Creek was ready to formalize their interest in a structure they had mocked for 2 months. They came individually, casually, on errands that happened to pass near Beret's claim. They came to return a tool or deliver a message or ask about Marte's fever. And while they were there, they looked at the walls. Beret taught the way Murtaugh had taught her, through action, not lecture. She placed a visitor's hand against the wall face and made them feel the lean. She showed them a through stone and asked them to pull it. They could not. She showed them the drainage trench and poured water into it and watched them watch the water flow through broken stone instead of pooling. Sunniva Haugland came with a notebook, not Marte's flour sack notebook, but a proper bound book she had bought from Vale before the storm. She wrote down measurements, wall thickness, batter angle, through stone spacing, capstone weight estimates, drainage trench depth, and fill. She wrote it all in careful Norwegian and then translated the key numbers into English so the measurements could be shared with families who did not read Norwegian. Beret saw the notebook and understood something she had not considered during the weeks of desperate construction. The passage was not just a shelter. It was a pattern. It could be copied, adapted, scaled down, simplified. Not every family needed a 42-foot stone corridor. Some needed a 10-foot entry bank. Some needed a reinforced root cellar. Some needed nothing more than a curved drift wall that caught snow before it reached the roof. The method was portable. The principle was simple. Let the weight travel through stone and earth into the ground, not through thin timber into the living space. Build with lean, not with pride. Let the wall breathe. Let the water leave. These were not engineering secrets. They were the lessons of a Norwegian sheepfold and an Irish mason's career, combined by a 56-year-old widow who had been too stubborn to accept the conventional wisdom that had nearly killed the town. Addison Vale's response to the validation was predictable. He did not apologize. He did not visit. He did not acknowledge that his store had nearly collapsed while Beret's passage held. What he did was reframe. My store could have held if men had shoveled sooner, he said at the stove, to the diminished group of men who still gathered there. The problem was not the roof. The problem was the response. If my crew had started shoveling at midnight instead of dawn, the back wall would still be standing. The men listened. Some nodded. It was easier to accept Vale's version, a story about timing and labor, than to accept Beret's version, which was a story about fundamental design failure. Accepting Beret's version meant admitting that every roof in Kettle Creek was built wrong, and admitting that required action, and action required effort, and effort required changing the way things had always been done. Vale held the narrative for about a week. Then a second drift came, smaller than the first, but wet, and it landed on the already weakened structures with the precision of a second blow to a cracked beam. The store's patched back wall bowed again. This time the snow load pushed an interior shelf sideways, and 200 pounds of goods, lamp oil, salt pork, nails, tobacco, spilled onto the store floor. The lamp oil cracked and soaked into the flour that Vale had moved to a lower shelf after the first collapse. Vale had saved his goods before his customers' homes during the first storm. Now his goods were ruined by the second storm because he had repaired the wall with the same shallow-pitch timber framing that had failed the first time. The irony was not lost on Kettle Creek. It was the kind of irony that settles into a community's memory and stays there, reshaping the story every time it is retold. Vale's authority did not collapse the way his back wall did, suddenly, with a sound everyone could hear. It eroded. Families who had bought on credit began paying in labor trades instead of cash, cutting Vale out of the transaction. Men who had nodded at his stove began asking Phelps questions about roof pitch and stone banking instead. Women brought their notebooks to Beret. Vale still owned debts. He still owned the store. He still held Beret's $28, but he no longer owned the story of how Kettle Creek had survived the winter. That story belonged to a woman who built a road for ghosts and filled it with the living. Murtaugh Kinane and Beret Kavama had known each other for 7 weeks. In that time, they had torn down walls and rebuilt them, argued about stone placement and batter angles, shared meals cooked on a cracked stove, and sat together in a stone corridor while the sky tried to crush them. Their relationship was not friendship in the way that people use the word casually. It was the bond between two people who had done difficult work together and come through it with mutual respect intact. After the storm, the bond deepened into something that looked like partnership. They worked together on repairs, checking the passage for frost damage, resetting 2 capstones that had shifted fractionally under the second drift, deepening the drainage trench where meltwater had pooled during the thaw between storms. Murtaugh told his stories during work. He had come from County Clare as a boy of 14, worked stone for canal contractors in Ohio, built culverts for the railroad in Minnesota, and ended up in Dakota Territory because the railroad line he was working ended there and he did not have the money or the inclination to go back. He had built stone for pay his entire life. Walls, foundations, bridge abutments, root cellars, retaining walls, drainage culverts. He had built for contractors who paid by the linear foot and did not care if the wall lasted past the warranty period. He had built for homesteaders who could not afford to pay at all and gave him a meal and a roof instead. "I built for money my whole life," he said one afternoon, fitting a replacement capstone with hands that trembled but still found the right angle. "This is the first time I built for a reason that mattered more than the money." "The money would also have been welcome," Beret said. Murtaugh laughed, which turned into a cough, which turned into a silence that lasted long enough for Beret to look at him carefully. His color had changed since the storm. The cough was always present now, not the occasional clearing of cold air from tired lungs, but a continuous, rattling presence that lived in his chest the way water lives in a cracked wall. It was inside him, and it was not leaving. He did not speak about it. Beret did not ask. They worked. The disagreement came during the second week of January, when Beret wanted to extend the passage by 8 feet on the leeward side to create a covered woodshed. Murtaugh argued against it. The extension would require new foundation work in frozen ground, which meant digging through frost-hardened earth that would heave when the thaw came. He said the passage was complete. He said adding to it now risked destabilizing the section where the new wall met the old. "You built a thing that works," Murtaugh said. "Leave it alone. A thing that works can work better. A thing that works can also break if you keep touching it." They argued for an hour. It was not a gentle argument. Murtaugh raised his voice, which cost him a coughing fit that doubled him over. Beret raised hers, which cost her nothing physically, but which Marte recorded in the notebook with the annotation, "Grandmother shouted." M shouted back. "Wall stays." The wall stayed. Beret conceded the point, not because she was wrong about the woodshed's usefulness, but because Murtaugh was right about the risk of new foundation work in frozen ground. She built a simpler solution instead. A freestanding stone windbreak, 3 feet high and 10 feet long, curved to catch the prevailing wind and create a sheltered pocket where firewood could be stacked without drifting over. Murtaugh watched her build it and said nothing until the last stone was placed. Then he said, "That is better than what I would have done." "You would have done nothing." "Nothing is sometimes better. This time it was not." Murtaugh's cough worsened through January and into February. The cold did not cause it. The cold revealed it, the way cold reveals the cracks in stone that warm weather hides. He had been sick for longer than he had known Beret. The railroad years, the wet culverts, the stone dust, the winters spent sleeping in camps with open fires and no ventilation, all of it had settled in his lungs the way sediment settles in a trench. The storm walk had finished what the years had started. He taught one final lesson during a thaw in late February. The temperature rose above freezing for 3 days, and meltwater ran down from the ridge and pooled against the uphill side of the passage. The drainage trench handled most of it, but Murtaugh saw water seeping through a section where the trench had silted up over the winter. "Clean it," he told Beret. "Now, before the next freeze." It is a small seep. A small seep freezes into a small wedge. A small wedge splits a big stone. Clean it now. She cleaned it. He watched, leaning on his stick, his breath visible in short, clouded bursts that came too fast and too shallow. When she finished, he showed her something else, a relief trench, cut perpendicular to the main drainage, angled downhill to carry overflow away from the base during fast thaws. "Never trust spring water behind a winter wall," he said. "The wall held the snow, it held the cold, but spring water moves with a patience that snow does not have. It finds the crack you missed, it finds the joint you left too tight, it finds the place where you were tired and set a stone without listening." He taught her how to cut the relief trench, shallow, angled, lined with flat stones to prevent erosion. It took an hour. It was the last hour of stonework Murtaugh Kinane would do. He died in Beret's cabin on a night in early March, not during a storm, not during a crisis. On a quiet night when the stove was warm and Marte was asleep and the passage stood in silence outside the door. He coughed less in the last hour, which was how Beret knew. The coughing had been his companion for so long that its absence was louder than its presence. She sat with him. She did not speak because there was nothing to say that the work had not already said. He had come to her claim because he heard a hammer and recognized competence. He had stayed because the work was worth staying for. He had taught her everything he knew about stone, not as a gift, but as a transfer between equals who happened to have different lengths of experience. His last words were not about stone. They were about the hammer, the mason's hammer he had carried from County Clare to Ohio to Minnesota to Dakota Territory. He asked that it go to Marte when she was old enough to know its weight. Beret wrapped the hammer in the same wool cloth she used for her own hands. She placed it on the shelf above the stove where Marte could see it every morning. She buried Murtaugh beside the east wall of the cabin near Torbjörn in ground that was still partially frozen and required an axe to break. There were no words for this kind of loss, not the sharp, sudden loss of a son under a fallen wagon, but the slow, expected loss of a man who had walked into her life when she needed him and stayed until staying was no longer possible. Beret did not cry at the graveside. She stood in the March wind with Marte beside her and looked at the stone passage that carried both their hands, his knowledge and her labor, fitted together like through stones tying two faces of a wall into one. The passage stood. The wall leaned inward. The drainage trench was clean. The relief trench carried meltwater downhill. Every lesson Murtaugh had taught was embedded in the stone itself, readable by anyone who knew how to look. Marty held the flour sack notebook against her chest. The last entry read, "M died quiet. Wall still holds." The spring thaw came fast that year, as if winter had spent everything it had in December and wanted the account closed. Temperatures rose, snow melted. Water ran from every ridge and slope and hillside in Kettle Creek, carrying the accumulated weight of the season downhill toward the low ground where the settlement sat. The town's emergency food cellar was a sod-roofed dugout at the south end of the settlement, dug into a hillside and stocked with salted meat, flour, dried beans, and root vegetables that had survived the winter through communal contribution. It fed families whose own stores had been ruined by roof collapses and moisture damage. Losing it would mean hunger through the weeks between snowmelt and first planting. The meltwater reached the cellar on a Tuesday. It seeped through the hillside and pooled against the back wall of the dugout, turning the packed earth floor to mud. The sod roof, already weakened by the winter's snow load, began to sag as the earth above it absorbed water and gained weight. Phelps arrived first. He assessed the situation with the efficiency of a man who has been wrong once and intends to be right from now on. His solution was timber. Brace the doorway, shore the ceiling beams, pack the back wall with boards to hold back the mud. Beret arrived second. She looked at the hillside above the cellar, the water running down the slope, the saturated earth pressing against the back wall. She looked at the bracing timber Phelps had brought and the boards he intended to pack against the mud. "The timber will shift," she said. "Timber holds if it is braced properly." Timber holds against a static load. Water is not static. It moves behind the boards. It finds the joint between the brace and the wall. It lifts the brace. The brace tilts. The ceiling follows. Phelps looked at her. 3 months ago he would have dismissed this. Now he waited. "Drain it first," Beret said. "Cut a trench above the cellar. Divert the water around the hillside before it reaches the back wall. Then brace." Vale arrived in time to hear the last part. He had come because the food cellar held goods he had contributed, at credit prices, and his investment was at risk. "We need that food today," Vale said. "Digging ditches while the cellar fills is a waste of hours we do not have. Bracing a wall while water presses behind it is a waste of timber you cannot replace," Beret replied. The argument lasted 5 minutes. It ended when Phelps set down his timber and picked up a spade. "We drain first," Phelps said. Vale stood aside. He did not help dig. He watched, and his watching had the quality of a man who understands that the ground beneath his authority has shifted and is trying to find new footing. They cut the relief trench in 2 hours, 6 people digging, Beret directing the angle and depth from Murtaugh's final lesson. The trench intercepted the meltwater flow above the cellar and diverted it around the hillside in a gentle curve that dumped the water into the creek drainage 50 feet below. Within an hour of completion, the seepage against the back wall slowed. Within 3 hours, it stopped. Then they braced. Phelps set his timber against a back wall that was damp, but no longer under hydraulic pressure. The braces held because there was nothing behind them trying to move. The first timber brace that Phelps had originally set, before the trench, shifted in the mud 2 hours later, proving Beret's point without anyone needing to state it. The brace tilted sideways and dropped 6 inches. If the ceiling had been resting on it, the ceiling would have dropped with it. Phelps looked at the fallen brace. He looked at the trench. He said, "Murdoch?" "Murdoch," Beret said. His last lesson: never trust spring water behind a winter wall. If this story reminds you why preparation matters before anyone believes you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. After the food cellar was secured, people stopped coming to Beret individually and started coming in groups. Not organized groups. Kettle Creek did not organize that way, but clusters of 2 and 3 with questions that had specificity. Not, "How did you do it?" but "How wide should the base be for a wall that is only 3 feet high?" Not, "Does stone really work?" but "Which stones do I reject and which do I keep?" Beret taught. She taught the way Murtaugh had taught, through placement, through correction, through making people feel the wall before she explained it. She placed a man's hand against the inner face of the passage and asked him to push. He pushed. The wall did not move. She placed his hand against a stack of loose stones the same height and asked him to push. The stack fell. "The difference," she said, "is lean." She taught 3 scaled-down versions of her method. The first was a stone and sod entry bank, a curved wall built against the windward side of a cabin door, 4 feet high, 2 feet thick, with batter and through stones. It caught drift before it reached the roof edge and blocked wind from entering the cabin through the door gap. Peter Haugland built the first one. It took him 4 days. The second was a low retaining wall, 3 feet high, 1 foot thick, built in a curve upwind of the cabin. It did not block wind entirely, but it caught the heaviest drift and deposited it against the wall instead of against the roof. 3 families built versions of this within 2 weeks. The third was a reinforced root cellar shelter for families who had no timber left for roof repair. Beret adapted the corbelled passage design into a smaller, lower shelter, 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, 4 feet high, that could serve as emergency refuge during storms. It required fewer stones than the full passage, but the same principles: batter, through stones, drainage, corbelling. She marked the keystones with charcoal symbols so neighbors who could not read her instructions could recognize the types by sight. A circle meant a through stone, long enough to tie the wall faces together. A triangle meant a face stone. Flat, dense, good for the outer and inner surfaces. A wavy line meant a drain stone, placed at the base with gaps for water to pass through. A square meant a capstone, wide enough to bridge the gap at the top of the wall. Marte copied the symbols into her notebook and then onto pieces of flower paper that could be passed from family to family. She drew the symbols alongside simple sketches showing placement, through stone across the wall, face stone on the surface, drain stone at the base with the gap visible. She drew these in the careful, precise hand of a child who had spent months watching her grandmother reject bad stones and place good ones. And the drawings were clearer than most adult diagrams because they contained only what mattered and nothing else. Beret's authority grew the way stone walls grow, one course at a time, each layer resting on the one below it, each new family's adoption adding weight and stability to the structure of trust. She did not seek it. She did not announce it. She built walls and showed people how to build walls and answered questions about stone and drainage and batter with the patience of a woman who had heard all the doubts already and did not need to hear them again. People came to her now, not the other way around. That was the change Kettle Creek noticed without naming it, the reversal of direction. Before the storm, Beret had gone to Phelps for assessment, to Hogland for advice, to Vail for credit. Now Phelps came to Beret for inspection. Hogland came for instruction. Only Vail stayed away, and his absence spoke as loudly as the other's presence. The winter was not over. More snow fell in March. More cold came. But the edge of danger had dulled because the town was no longer waiting for the next storm the way a man waits for a blow he cannot block. They were building against it. They were leaning into the weight, the way a wall leans into a hill, and the weight was becoming something they could carry instead of something that carried them under. By April, Kettle Creek looked like a settlement that had been taken apart and put back together by different hands. The roof lines had changed. 3 cabins sported new ridge beams set at steeper pitches. Phelps's work, done with the exacting care of a man correcting his own prior advice. 2 others had stone and sod entry banks curving away from their front doors, the fieldstone faces showing the deliberate inward lean that Beret had taught. The Hoagland cabin had been rebuilt entirely from the ridge beam down, with Pater's new entry bank anchoring the windward side like a shoulder braced against a weight that had not yet arrived but would. The schoolhouse, which had lost its roof during the December storm and spent the winter as an open-walled ruin, was the first communal project. Phelps framed the new roof at a steep pitch, 45 degrees, nearly twice the angle of the original mine, using milled lumber he traded for at cost from a sawmill 30 miles east. He refused to frame a flat winter roof. He told the schoolhouse committee that any man who wanted a flat roof could build it himself, and any man who built a flat roof would shovel it himself, and any man who failed to shovel it would bury his own children. Phelps had never spoken to a committee that way. The committee approved the steep roof without further discussion. Beret built the schoolhouse entry. Not alone, Pater helped, and Sunniva, and 3 men whose names Beret had learned during the December nights inside the passage, when 11 people had shared a corridor built for 3. The entry was a simplified version of the passage design, a curved stone and sod bank 8 feet long, 4 feet high, with proper batter and through stones and a drainage trench along the uphill side. It shielded the schoolhouse door from the prevailing northwest wind and created a sheltered pocket where children could gather before class without standing in the open. Marte laid the first stone. Barrette placed her hand over Marte's hand, and together they set it into the foundation trench with the lean that Murdo had taught, 1 inch inward per foot of rise, the angle that makes a wall think instead of stand proud. Marte felt the lean through her palm and nodded, and Barrette knew the knowledge had transferred the way knowledge transfers between people who learn through their hands, not as words, but as a feeling that the body remembers even when the mind has moved on to other things. The second communal root cellar was finished in May. This one was built properly from the start. Corbelled stone walls, earth cover, drainage trenches on 3 sides, and a reinforced entry with capstones heavy enough that 2 men had to carry each one. Barrette oversaw the construction. She did not do the heavy lifting. Her hands had healed from the worst of the winter's damage, but the joints ached in a way that would not improve, and she had learned from Murtaugh that a builder who cannot grip a stone can still direct the hands that do. She directed by touch. She placed a worker's hand against a stone and asked what they felt, solid or hollow, dense or cracked, warm from the sun or cold from the ground. She made them strike the hammer and listen. She made them hold the plumb line and check the batter on every third course. She corrected the way Murtaugh had corrected, by demonstration, not by lecture. She moved a stone a worker had placed, showed the gap it left, replaced it with the proper lean, and stepped back so the worker could see the difference. By summer, 6 stone-banked entries stood in Kettle Creek. 2 communal root cellars were operational. The schoolhouse had a steep roof and a protected entry. 3 families had built freestanding drift walls, low, curved stone, upwind of their cabins. None of these structures were as large or as ambitious as Barrette's original passage, but all of them carried the same principles. Lean into the weight, tie the faces together, let the water leave. Addison Vale had spent the winter and spring watching his position in Kettle Creek shift beneath him the way a foundation shifts when the water table rises. His store was still the only store. His ledger still held debts from every family in the settlement. His prices still controlled access to nails, lamp oil, flour, salt, coffee, and the 100 other necessities that a prairie settlement could not produce for itself. But the currency of Kettle Creek had changed. Before the storm, currency was credit, Vale's credit, extended at Vale's rates, recorded in Vale's book, called in at Vale's discretion. After the storm, currency was knowledge, Barrette's knowledge, and knowledge, unlike credit, could not be controlled by a single man with a ledger. Families that had borrowed from Vale to buy lumber for flat roofs now traded labor directly with each other to build stone entry banks. Families that had bought nails on credit now gathered fieldstone for free from the creek bank and the ridge face. Families that had depended on Vale's good opinion to maintain standing in the community now depended on Barrette's instruction to protect their homes. Vale felt the shift the way a storekeeper feels a shift in trade, not as a single loss, but as a pattern of smaller losses that accumulate. Fewer credit purchases, fewer men at his stove, fewer families needing his opinion on building methods. The social architecture of Kettle Creek had reorganized itself around a different center, and Vale was no longer at it. He held Barrette's debt, $28, nails, lamp oil, winter credit. The debt was real, recorded in ink, witnessed by custom if not by law. Vale had always intended to call it in when Barrette failed. When the claim was abandoned, the ox was sold, and the land passed to him for the cost of forgiven credit. Barrette had not failed. The claim was occupied. The ox had survived the winter and was recovering. The land had not only been improved, but had become the most talked about improvement in the settlement. Vale could still call the debt, but calling it now, after the storm, after the rescue, after the community had walked through Barrette's stone corridor to survive the night, calling it now would look like punishment for succeeding, and even Vale understood that punishment for success was a currency that bought nothing. He waited. He waited through the thaw and the planting season and the early summer, holding the $28 the way a man holds a card he can only play once. He waited until August, when the memory of the December storm had faded enough that gratitude was no longer the settlement's dominant emotion, and then he sent word to Beret that the balance was due. Beret received the message from a boy who worked at the store. She read it standing in the passage entry, where the August sun warmed the stone face, and the air smelled of dust and dried grass instead of snow and wood smoke. $28. She had $7 in coin from selling eggs and butter through the summer. 7 was not 28. She did not go to Vale. She went to her cabin and sat at the table and looked at the hammer on the shelf above the stove and thought about Murtaugh, who had built for money his whole life, and said that this was the first time the reason mattered more. Then she went to the passage and touched the wall and felt the lean and the through stones and the capstones, and knew that the wall was the proof that the debt was unjust, not illegal, not fictional, but unjust in the way that a fair price becomes unfair when the buyer has no alternative and the seller knows it. She did not have $28. She also did not have to face Vale alone. Phelps arrived at Vale's store on a Thursday morning with Peter Haugland, Sunniva Haugland, and 3 other men, the same men who had carried their families through Beret's tunnel during the December storm. Phelps carried coin. Peter carried a written account of labor hours contributed to community building projects over the winter and spring, valued at standard day labor rates. Sunniva carried the notebook with wall measurements and construction records, which documented Beret's improvements to the claim in detail that no land office could dispute. The 3 other men carried witness statements, signed and dated, affirming Beret's continuous residence and improvement on the claim since the date of filing. The statements were written in English by Phelps, who had the steadiest hand, and they included specific descriptions of the stone passage, the entry dimensions, the drainage works, and the structural condition of the cabin and outbuildings. Vale looked at the group assembled in his store. He looked at the coin, the labor account, the notebooks, the witness statements. He looked at Phelps, who stood with the patience of a man who has come to settle a debt and intends to stay until it is settled. "The balance is $28, Vale said. "The balance is $28 for supplies advanced against a claim that is now the most improved property in Kettle Creek," Phelps said. "I have $12 in coin here. Pater has a labor account worth $9 at standard rates. Beret has $7 of her own, that is $28. Labor accounts are not legal tender. Legal tender is for banks. We are in a store. You have accepted labor credit from every man in this room at one time or another, Addison. You accepted it from me last spring when I framed your storage shed. You accepted it from Pater when he hauled freight for you in October. You will accept it now." Vale looked at the witness statements. He understood what they meant. They were not weapons. They were armor. As long as those statements existed, any attempt to challenge Beret's claim on grounds of insufficient improvement or interrupted residency would fail. The stone passage alone was more improvement than most homesteaders achieved in 5 years of residence. "She built a good cellar," Vale said. "It was grudging. It was inadequate. It was an attempt to reduce the passage to something smaller, a cellar, a storage hole, a practical but unremarkable feature of a claim." "No," Beret said. She had arrived at the store door while the men were talking. She stood in the threshold with the August light behind her. "A good door." Vale looked at her. Beret looked back. The distance between them was the width of the store and the width of a winter and the width of everything that had changed since Vale had stood at her claim and offered to take her land for the price of a windowless room. "Sign the debt clear," Phelps said, "or I can inspect your store roof with the same confidence you showed in mine." The room was silent. Phelps's meaning was clear to everyone present. The store roof had been patched, not rebuilt. The steep pitch framing that Phelps now insisted on for every structure in the settlement had not been applied to Vale's own building. The store remained the most vulnerable roof in Kettle Creek, and everyone in the room knew it, and everyone in the room knew that Phelps knew it, and Phelps was not above making that knowledge public. Vale signed. He wrote, "Paid in full," across the ledger entry and dated it, and pushed the book forward on the counter. He did not shake hands. He did not offer coffee. He said, "The account is closed." Beret took the ledger entry, Phelps had insisted on a torn page as receipt and walked out of the store into August heat that felt like freedom from a room she had never wanted to enter. The partnership between Beret Kvam and Orrin Phelps was not romantic. It was structural. Phelps was a carpenter. Beret was a mason. He understood timber, spans, joints, load paths through wood grain, the behavior of cottonwood versus oak versus milled pine. She understood stone, density, lean, drainage, the behavior of fieldstone under freeze-thaw cycles, the way a curve distributes weight that a flat surface concentrates. Together, they covered the two materials that built everything in Kettle Creek. The partnership began with the schoolhouse and continued through the summer and into the fall. Phelps framed roofs. Beret designed entries. Phelps calculated timber spans. Beret specified stone foundations. Phelps cut joints. Beret fitted through stones. They argued about nearly everything: the angle of a roof pitch, the depth of a drainage trench, the placement of a doorway relative to the prevailing wind, and the arguments produced better buildings because each argument forced both of them to defend their reasoning with specifics instead of opinion. Phelps had never worked with a woman as a professional equal. The Army had not prepared him for it. The frontier had not prepared him for it. Beret's competence had prepared him for it, one corrected assumption at a time, starting with the moment he stood in her doorway and told her that snow falls light, and ending with the moment he stood in her corridor and said nothing, because nothing was the only honest response. He did not apologize for the months of dismissal. Beret did not require apology. They built instead. Building was the language they shared, and it was more precise than English or Norwegian or any spoken language that required translation. A stone placed correctly needed no explanation. A joint cut cleanly needed no defense. The work spoke, and they listened to it, and the work was good. By the second winter, the winter of 1881 into 82, Kettle Creek was a different settlement, not unrecognizable. The same families, the same store, the same schoolhouse and church frame and scatter of claim cabins along the creek. But the edges had hardened. Roof lines were steeper. Entries were sheltered. 3 families had full stone-banked passages, smaller than Beret's original, but built on the same principles. The communal root cellars stored enough food for 6 weeks of isolation. Drift walls caught snow before it reached the vulnerable structures. The second winter was cold but dry, the kind of winter Phelps had originally described, with blowing powder and manageable drifts. The stone banks and steep roofs were not tested the way the first winter had tested them. Some families wondered if the extra work had been necessary. Beret did not argue. She knew the way her father had known, that a wall built for the worst storm protects during every storm, and the years when the worst storm does not come are not evidence that the wall was unnecessary. They are evidence that the wall is waiting. The years compress the way years do when the crisis is past, and the life that follows is built on the foundation the crisis created. Beret proved up her claim in 1883. The land office inspector walked the property, examined the cabin, the stone passage, the entry banks, the drainage works, and the root cellar. He wrote in his report that the improvements were exceptional for a single filer claim, and noted the stone construction with a specificity that suggested he had never seen anything like it in Dakota Territory. He asked Beret how she had learned the technique. She said her father built sheepfolds in Norway, and an Irish mason corrected her batter. The inspector wrote down sheepfolds and batter, and left without fully understanding either one. But the claim was proved and the land was Beret's, and no ledger entry or store credit or windowless back room could take it from her. Marte grew. She grew the way children grow when they have been through something that most adults have not, with a seriousness that was not sadness and a competence that was not precocity. She could identify a through stone by touch before she was 11. She could check batter with a plumb line by 12. She could direct a crew of grown men in wall construction by 14, not because she had authority, but because she had knowledge. And knowledge on the frontier was the only authority that could not be taken away by weather or debt or the opinions of people who had never built anything that lasted. She kept the flour sack notebook until the pages wore through, then transferred the entries to a proper bound book that Sunniva Haugland gave her for her 12th birthday. The charcoal symbols she had drawn, circle for through stone, triangle for face stone, wavy line for drain stone, square for capstone, were copied onto flower paper and passed from claim to claim with measurements written in Norwegian, English, and rough sketches for families who read neither well. The diagrams traveled further than Beret's voice could carry. They reached homesteaders on the James River, on the Cheyenne, along the Mouse River Loop. They were copied and recopied until the original symbols lost their precision, but the principles held because the principles were not drawings. They were physics. Phelps built steep roofs for another 12 years. He never framed a flat winter roof again without warning the owner, in writing, signed, and witnessed, that the roof would fail under wet snow load, and the failure would be the owner's responsibility. 3 owners ignored the warning. 2 of them lost roofs. The third shoveled for 48 continuous hours during a wet storm in 1887 and afterwards tore the flat roof off and hired Phelps to build it steep. Phelps charged him double, not out of spite, but out of a professional conviction that a man who ignores a written warning should pay for the education twice. Sunniva Haugland kept her notebook for 20 years. It grew from wall measurements into a comprehensive record of construction techniques, food storage methods, storm preparation protocols, and community labor exchanges. The notebook was not a book. It was the institutional memory of a settlement that had no institution, carried by a woman who understood that knowledge written down outlasts knowledge spoken aloud. Peter Haugland never fully admitted that he had been wrong about Beret's passage. He did not need to. He built stone entry banks on every structure he owned, and his son built them after him, and the Haugland farm was never damaged by a winter storm in the 30 years that followed. His silence on the subject of being wrong was its own kind of admission, the kind that builds walls instead of making speeches. Addison Vale sold the store in 1885. The buyer was a younger man from Fargo who did not know the history and did not carry the ledger like a weapon. Vale moved east. He was not ruined. He had money. He had property elsewhere. He had the survival instincts of a man who understood when a market had turned against him. He was simply no longer relevant. The settlement had reorganized itself around a different principle, not credit, but competence, not dependency, but shared knowledge. And Vale's particular skills had no purchase in the new arrangement. He was seen once more in Kettle Creek, passing through on a coach in 1889. He did not stop at the store. He did not visit Beret's claim. He looked out the coach window at the stone-banked entries and the steep roof lines and the drift walls curving upwind of the cabins, and he said nothing to his traveling companion about any of it. The companion, a land speculator from Bismarck, asked about the stone construction. Vale said it was local custom and changed the subject. Beret Kavama lived on the same claim she had refused to abandon. The cabin was expanded twice, once in 1884 when Phelps helped frame a lean-to addition on the south side, and once in 1890 when Marte's husband, Spau, a carpenter's apprentice from Fargo named Anders Solheim, whom Marte had met when he came to study the stone entry banks, and stayed because the teacher interested him more than the technique guy, built a proper second room with a stone foundation that Marte specified herself. The stone passage stood for every winter that followed. It was repaired once, in 1888, when a spring flood undermined 2 base stones on the uphill side, and Beret and Marte relayed the section in a single afternoon. The repair was invisible from inside. The passage grew darker as the earth and sod cover settled and thickened, and the interior smelled less of new stone and more of age. Damp earth, old smoke, the mineral breath of fieldstone that has been carrying weight for years without complaint. Beret never let anyone plaster over one intersection of stone. It was the section where Murtaugh had corrected her batter. The first 12 feet, torn down and rebuilt with the proper lean, the through stones visible as slight protrusions along the face. She left it exposed so children could see how the wall leaned, so they could place their palms against the stone and feel the angle, so they could understand through their hands what Murtaugh had understood through a lifetime of building and what Beret had understood through a childhood memory of a sheepfold wall in western Norway. Marte's children played in the corridor during storms. They built forts from firewood stacked against the inner wall. They named the through stones. Each one had a character, a personality assigned by a 4-year-old's imagination. The largest through stone near the entry was called Old Murtaugh. Beret heard the name and said nothing, and touched the stone once with her palm, when the children were not looking. She died in the cabin in March of 1896, not during a storm, but during one sow, a late-season wet snow that fell heavy and sat on the roofs of Kettle Creek and did not collapse a single one. Marte was with her. Anders was with her. 2 grandchildren were playing in the corridor, and the sound of their voices came through the connecting doorway, the way sounds come through stone, softened, carried, held. The hammer sat on the shelf above the stove where Beret had placed it after Murdaugh's death, 12 years earlier. Marty took it down that evening and held it, and felt the weight of it, the weight of County Clare and Ohio and Minnesota and Dakota Territory, the weight of culverts and bridge abutments and root cellars, and one curved passage that an Irish mason and a Norwegian widow had built together while the town laughed and the sky waited. She put the hammer in her toolbox. She would use it the next morning to check a stone on the schoolhouse entry that had shifted a 1/4 inch during the thaw. A 1/4 inch was enough to notice. A 1/4 inch was enough to fix. Within 2 winters of the mortar snow, at least a dozen families around Kettle Creek had copied some part of Beret's design. Not everyone built a full stone passage. Some built entry banks. Some built drift walls. Some rebuilt roofs steeper and stronger because Phelps refused to frame a flat winter roof without a signed warning. Marte's charcoal-marked diagrams were copied onto flour paper and passed from claim to claim with measurements written in Norwegian, English, and rough sketches for families who read neither well. The symbols traveled 3 river drainages in 4 years, carried by women who understood that the best way to preserve knowledge was to give it away before it could be lost. Beret Kvama lived out her later years on the 160 acres she had held through one impossible winter, 1 lame ox, $28 of debt, and the collected doubt of every man who had built in Dakota Territory before her. She never moved. She never sold. She never let anyone plaster over the exposed section of interior stone where the batter changed from wrong to right, and Murdaugh's hand became part of the wall. She died in 1896, hearing her grandchildren's voices echo through the corridor during a March storm, and the passage carried the sound the way it carried everything, gently through stone into the ground. Wet snow, low sky, flat roofs, men laughing at a useless stone hallway. Orrin Phelps standing in Beret Kvam's doorway, tall, certain, experienced, saying the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. Snow falls light, Mrs. Kvama. Fear makes it heavy. 3 months later, the same Orrin Phelps carried a half-frozen child through Beret's side tunnel while the roofs of Kettle Creek groaned and cracked behind him. The same snow that crushed timber lay quiet and harmless over Beret's stone curve, sealing warmth inside, pressing the wall tighter, doing exactly what Beret said it would do, because the weight was not the enemy. The weight was the answer, if you built something that knew how to carry it. Years later, the cabin was gone. The claim fence was down. Grass grew over most of the passage, and wildflowers rooted in the sod cover each spring. But after every hard winter, the ridge shed meltwater around a curved mound of stone that still refused to move. The town forgot the laughter first. The stones remembered the weight.